So if we look at a slice of the pie, and for scope management, we notice we've got 4 planning processes and we've got 2 monitoring and controlling processes. So now we're going to talk about these processes in more detail. So first of all, we start with plan scope management. And of course, here we have the definition. It's the process of creating a scope management plan that documents how the project scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. It belongs in the planning process group. So fortunately, it has plan in the name, and it has scope in the name, so you know exactly where which box this would fill. It's right at the corner of plan and scope. So we've got our inputs, which are the charter, the PMP, the enterprise environmental factors, and the OPAs. And then we use our tools and techniques, which are expert judgment, data analysis, and meetings. And we have our outputs, which are the scope management plan, which is always wonderful when you have a process called plan scope management. And then you have your requirements management plan. And remember that I said there were those 4 lonely and sad documents. I may not have said they were lonely and sad, but I thought it. And they don't particularly have their own knowledge area. And so remember how we talk about the other project documents. Requirements management plan is one of those other documents. So next, we're going to collect requirements. And collect requirements is the process of determining, documenting, and managing stakeholders' needs and requirements to meet objectives, again, as part of the planning process group. So here, again, we're going to have a whole lot of inputs because obviously it's important to collect as many requirements as possible, hopefully all of the requirements, because ultimately any requirements we find later will become what? More or less expensive to implement. Right, they'll be more expensive.
So this is okay. So there's an actual name for this, collect requirements.
So this is one of the 49 processes. So our inputs include the charter, and remember, that has the high-level requirements in it, so that gives us a good place to start. We've got the project management plan. We've got the project documents, which include that requirements document that came out of the last process. So you have requirements management plan, so that is one of the project documents, which will help you to collect documents because now you've planned for how to do it. You've got any business documents, agreements, your external issues like your EEFs, and your organizational process assets, your OPAs. And then in order to collect requirements, we're going to apply a whole lot of tools and techniques because we want to make sure we do our best to get all the requirements in a timely manner. You know, we can't take all year to do it, and we want to make sure we're very thorough in doing it. So we're going to use our expert judgment. We're going to gather data. We're going to figure out how we want the data represented. We're going to use our interpersonal and team skills. We're going to make some decisions. We might use some context diagrams. We're going to analyze the data, and we might do some prototypes. And so what comes out of collect requirements is, of course, the requirements document and the related requirements traceability matrix. So now the requirements traceability matrix takes a requirement all through the life cycle such that you can find out, you know, so if you make a change to at some point to that requirement, you can reach out to all of its tentacles, as it were, and make sure that you're changing it in every particular place. So if you change a requirement, then you've got to change the associated design, you've got to change the implementation, you potentially have to change the testing, you potentially have to change, say, the documentation or the user manuals, what have you. So this requirements traceability matrix helps you perform those functions. Okay, so here is a business scenario, and I will let you read the problem statement and come up with a solution.
Okay. Okay, so she discovers that the software system will not support the performance requirements when the system is under the load of several hundred users. What happens now? Well, you know, if it was up to me, I'd already be writing something. I'd be identifying these flaws. I know that. Let's see. Unfortunately. Well, I know this probably doesn't fit with PMI, but I would be writing up, I would want to know exactly what is the impact. It doesn't support the performance requirements. I'd want to know what's required to get it in conformance so that it does support the performance requirements. I'd want to know what the costs were involved. I'd want to know what time involved. So I'd want to collect all the necessary data and utilize, you know, somebody else who was familiar to make a determination if this could be accomplished. Let me see.
And actually, I think that's an excellent solution and very close to what is suggested. Basically, they hadn't captured the customer requirements accurately, and so there does need to be some root cause work done to analyze exactly why they didn't capture those performance requirements, and you know, why they didn't then, you know, find those out somewhere else along the line until the very end. But basically, just like you said, you've got cost issues, you've got customer dissatisfaction issues, you've got schedule issues, and then this scenario also adds the low morale of team members, because there's nothing like getting something done and saying, how do you like it, and looking for a positive response, and having the customer say, this doesn't perform at load. So, which is often a problem with software, and often you just don't have 100 people at 1,000 different places, or 1,000 people at 100 different places banging on a system, you know, so you should have figured out some way to make that happen in testing. So how are we going to get all the requirements? Well, certainly one way is using our group creativity techniques. And so, you know, these are ways that we can try to gather requirements and get a solid understanding of the functionality that we need for the project. So certainly one is brainstorming, and I guess everybody's done brainstorming, so I won't say a lot about that, except that in the PMI world, when you're doing brainstorming, you should never throw out any idea, no matter how ridiculous it is, because PMI just wants you to be so very nice. Think of that halo and the clouds opening up and the rays coming down at you. But the brainstorming is, you know, maybe somebody says something ridiculous, but then that leads somebody else to think of something really sensible. Okay, then there's also nominal group technique, which has kind of a voting process to rank the most useful ideas for further brainstorming or prioritization. So, you know, you take in all those crazy ones.
Oh, the nominal.
Huh?
Oh, no, I was just reading, because some of these terms, like, I've never heard them used as far as this.
Yeah,
you know?
well, and I was going to say, and this is kind of, you know, again, this is PMI putting a name to a process. You know, brainstorming we all know, but nominal group technique, you know, might be actually, you know, you might call it different things, because it's really just sort of a enhancement of brainstorming to do some voting and prioritizing.
Now, did we finish with the group creativity?
No, we didn't. So
okay.
We talked a little bit about nominal group technique, and remember that was a refinement to brainstorming.
Okay.
So
and they rank
that.
most
and then we've got
ideas. Okay.
Huh? Okay, and then we've got idea or mind mapping, and there are actually tools that will help you do that. There's like a tool called Mindomo, and if this was Project Management 101, we'd go into a further list of all the tools that could be used for mind mapping. But basically, you have kind of a moderator, which of course you do in brainstorming too, and they help you map things and arrange them in some kind of organization, which you determine, by using the mind mapping tool. And that follows then logically into affinity diagram, which takes a large number of ideas, say that you came out of brainstorming or mind mapping, and putting the like ideas together so that you can say, if these are mutually exclusive, which one would be better? Or if these are, both things that are needed, how do we make those as compatible as possible? And then the fifth group creativity technique is multi-criteria decision analysis. So basically you come up with a matrix and you establish criteria, and then you set values so that you can basically rank things, kind of like in the nominal group technique where you might prioritize and things. This would actually, a numerical, by some kind of preset criteria for making a decision. Okay, then next we're going to go on to how the group decision-making techniques can be carried out. And certainly one way is to say that you've got to have unanimity. So the good thing about unanimity is everybody agrees. The bad thing about unanimity is everybody's got to get to that point that they agree, and that might take a long time, and it might not even be possible. So one way you might want to do that, and one method would be the Delphi technique. And if you think back to your,
Isn't that's a consensus technique, the
right,
Delphi?
Yeah, so if you go back to your, Ancient Classics 101 and you think of the Oracle at Delphi, basically you have one person who goes around from expert to expert. So rather than having everybody in the same room, say for brainstorming, you have the one person who goes around, and without asserting too much of their own views into the conversation, they try to get people to work towards something that they think is good. But using the Delphi technique, there's a little bit less pressure, because sometimes if you sit in the room and there's somebody who's sort of judged to be the expert, nobody wants to cross that expert. But if the individual who's going from person to person says, oh, how do you like this idea, you might get a different response, if you don't know who the idea is coming from. But at any rate, another group decision-making technique is, of course, using majority rule, which is more than 50% of the members of the group, because, then at least you've got more than half of the people who think it's good, and you have fewer naysayers to try to bring around, or, to work cohesively with on the rest of the project. Then you've got plurality, where the largest subgroup wins, and of course, the pitfall to plurality is more people are against that idea than are necessarily for that idea. And then you've got autocratic, which is the project manager or the subject matter expert, if the project manager is not the subject matter expert, just says, okay, this is the way it's going to be, and that's what we're going to do. So depending on how thoroughly the people believe that the subject matter expert or the project manager is an expert, or how docile they are, maybe they'll believe that and go forward, and maybe they won't. And so, depending on the group of people implementing the plan, whatever it is, you've got to see which of these decision-making techniques is the best and is the most achievable.
Sometimes I think to myself, there's so many different terminologies. Like we have, contingency theories, behavioral, trait, we have transactional, transformational. Sometimes I think we could just simplify it and just label, what type, what do we have? Is this a consensus? Is it the Delphi methodology? There's so many subtopics that almost mean the same thing.
Oh yes, and that's what PMI is trying to do here, is trying to standardize the language of project management so that hopefully everybody's talking about the same thing when they mean the same thing, except then they overload stuff like PV. So it's a hard task to accomplish.
Yeah.
But for the 4 hours of the exam, of course, you want to reconform your theories into PMI-centric ideas and use their terminology.
Yep. Oh, you're in trouble.
Yeah, otherwise you're going to confuse yourself. And again,
Yep.
that's why you want to have your brain dump. So to write down those definitions and terms and acronyms and things that just don't come as second nature to you or first nature. Okay, so here's an example of a requirements traceability matrix where you have the requirement number, and then you have the design section, and then you have the coding information. You know, these are the actual files where the code exists. And then in terms of testing, these are the tests that will be carried out. And then in terms of acceptance testing, these are the acceptance tests. So therefore, if somebody all of a sudden says, okay, I've got to make a change to the design, you know, SDD section 3.1, then you've got to, you know, look back into requirement 3.1.1.1 and say, okay, where, you know, how would this change in the design be reflected in these requirements? Are we actually fundamentally changing the requirements? And then, of course, if we are, you know, we've got to go through the change control process. And then depending on how far we've gotten forward in the life cycle, if we've coded it or done system testing or any acceptance testing, we've got to say, okay, which tests relate to this design change? And again, how are we going to make those changes? So say in the analysis of whether or not we should make the design change, the cost of all these things and the schedule ramifications and the personnel needs all need to play into, are we going to make this change? But this gives you a very forthright manner in which to trace all of the impacts throughout the project. You know, so if you do your requirements traceability matrix well enough, you should be able to do your tracing very well.